Rome, August 10, 258 AD. Under the blistering sun of a Roman summer, a crowd packed the square. The air was thick with heat and tension. In the middle of it all, Roman soldiers dragged a man in chains, a man in his early 30s, calm, composed, almost radiant in defiance. His name was Lawrence, and what awaited him at the center of the square wasn't just execution. It was torment designed to break the strongest wills, an iron grill set above a bed of glowing embers. The soldiers yanked off his clothes and strapped him to the grill like a piece of meat. The metal beneath him was already radiating heat, and the fire was stoked until it roared red. The smell of burning flesh hit the air. The crowd leaned in, bracing for cries of agony. But what they heard instead made history. With the kind of clarity that cuts through smoke and horror, Lawrence looked at his executioner and said, "You can turn me over. This side is already roasted." That single sentence, half joke, half miracle, stunned everyone. It would become one of the most famous martyrdom lines in Christian history. But how did this young deacon, just a church administrator, really end up roasted alive and somehow fearless? To understand that, we have to rewind. Lawrence was born around 225 AD in Huesca, a city in the Roman province of Hispania, modern-day Spain. Raised in a Christian family, he grew up deeply religious, intelligent, and spiritually curious. During his studies in Caesar Augusta, today's Zaragoza, he met a man who would change the course of his life, the future Pope Sixtus II. They became close like father and son, and when Sixtus was called to Rome, Lawrence followed. In 257 AD, when Sixtus became Pope, he appointed Lawrence to one of the most important roles in the early church, Archdeacon of Rome. This wasn't a ceremonial title. Lawrence was the first among the 7 deacons of the city, with real responsibilities, managing church funds, overseeing distribution to the poor, and safeguarding sacred objects. At a time when the church was operating under constant threat, Lawrence wasn't just keeping books, he was protecting people and principles. But peace didn't last. That same year, Emperor Valerian launched one of the fiercest crackdowns on Christians the Roman Empire had ever seen. His first edict targeted church leaders, bishops, priests, deacons, forcing them to renounce their faith or face exile. A year later, things escalated. A second edict: no more exile. Any Christian leader who refused to worship Roman gods would be executed. Rome was no longer safe. On August 6, 258, the crackdown hit the church head-on. Pope Sixtus II was caught conducting a liturgy in the catacombs of Praetextatus and was immediately executed, beheaded along with 4 deacons. When Lawrence got word, he rushed to the scene. According to tradition, he cried out, "Father, where are you going without your son?" Sixtus, in chains but resolute, replied, "I do not leave you, my son. I merely go ahead. In 3 days you will follow me." The Roman prefect now had his eye on Lawrence, not just because he was a Christian leader, but because he was the church's treasurer. The empire, greedy and suspicious, assumed the church had gold hidden away. Lawrence was ordered to hand over the treasures of the church within 3 days. He agreed, but used those 3 days not to gather valuables, but to give them away. Feverishly, secretly, he distributed everything to the poor, the sick, the elderly. Then, when the deadline came, he stood before the prefect not with gold, but with a procession of beggars and the broken-hearted. "These," he declared, "are the true treasures of the church." The prefect was livid. What Lawrence had done wasn't just defiance, it was humiliation. To parade the sick, the crippled, and the poor as the treasures of the church wasn't only bold, it mocked Rome's entire value system. In the prefect's eyes, Lawrence wasn't just a criminal. He was an insolent enemy of the state. And enemies of the state didn't die quick, clean deaths. They were made examples of. The order came down. Lawrence would be executed by grilling. It was one of the slowest and most agonizing forms of torture the Romans ever devised. The flames weren't meant to incinerate. They were carefully managed to cook a person alive over hours, skin blistering, muscles searing, pain deepening with every breath. But what happened that day shattered expectations. Lawrence didn't scream. He didn't curse. He didn't beg. In fact, he kept his composure, his dignity, and even his humor. That now famous line, "You can turn me over, this side is already roasted," wasn't some apocryphal flourish added centuries later. It was reported by multiple sources and passed down in the earliest accounts of his death. Whether said through gritted teeth or in some divine state of peace, it turned Lawrence from a victim into a symbol. Some historians argue that this scene was exaggerated or even fictional. They claim Lawrence might have been executed by beheading, like the other deacons, and that the grill story came later as a piece of inspirational storytelling. But if that were true, it wouldn't explain why the grill became such a central symbol in the art and iconography of Lawrence. It wouldn't explain why painters like Fra Angelico and Titian chose to depict him not in fear or agony, but bathed in golden light, eyes lifted to heaven. It wouldn't explain why, less than a century after his death, people were already building churches over the site of his grave. Because regardless of how he died, what Lawrence stood for lived on. His defiant words, his compassion for the poor, and his refusal to betray the sacred values of his faith became foundational to how early Christians saw courage. This wasn't just martyrdom. It was a redefinition of wealth, a redefinition of power. Rome had tried to strip the church of its valuables, but Lawrence had already given them away. Rome tried to crush his spirit, but he burned brighter than the flame. After his death, fellow Christians retrieved his body and buried him in the cemetery along the Via Tiburtina. The site became a place of pilgrimage, and when Christianity was finally legalized under Emperor Constantine decades later, a basilica was built over Lawrence's tomb. That basilica would grow into San Lorenzo Fuori le Mura, one of the 7 pilgrimage churches of Rome. And that was only the beginning. Lawrence's influence rippled far beyond Rome. Back in his homeland of Spain, King Philip II built the monastery of El Escorial in the 16th century, an architectural marvel shaped like a grill, deliberately designed to honor the very instrument of Lawrence's martyrdom. It was a bold statement, a monument not to vengeance or war, but to spiritual victory in the face of torture. Across Europe, artists and poets kept Lawrence's memory alive. Painters like Rubens and Titian captured his final moments with a strange mix of horror and transcendence. His body writhing on the grill, yes, but his face often serene, eyes turned upward as if already halfway to heaven. In literature, writers like the Roman Christian poet Prudentius composed hymns praising Lawrence's strength and unshakable faith. His story wasn't just being told, it was becoming part of the cultural and spiritual foundation of the Christian West. But what makes Lawrence's story endure is more than just dramatic martyrdom or miraculous calm. It's the values he embodied. When he stood before the prefect and declared the poor, the sick, and the forgotten to be the true treasures of the church, he turned an entire empire's hierarchy upside down. He didn't just die bravely, he lived courageously. His message challenged the wealthy, the powerful, and the corrupt to reconsider what true worth looks like. And his martyrdom transformed that message into something eternal. Even the smallest details of Lawrence's story took on symbolic weight. His famous joke, "You can turn me over, this side is already roasted," wasn't just gallows humor. It became a metaphor for defiant faith, for spiritual resilience under fire, literally and figuratively. And the idea that he prayed not only for himself, but for the conversion of Rome, while his flesh was being scorched, that image, however unbelievable it may seem, is one of the most powerful testaments to grace ever recorded. According to some early Christian sources, several Roman senators who witnessed the event were so shaken by his composure that they converted on the spot. Today, Lawrence is remembered not only as a martyr, but also as a patron saint of the poor, of cooks in an ironic nod to the grill, and of librarians for his role in safeguarding the church's wisdom and texts. His feast day is celebrated on August 10th, the same day he died. And every year, right around that date, The sky seems to acknowledge him. The Perseid meteor shower, known in Catholic tradition as the Tears of St. Lawrence, paints the night with falling stars, like glowing embers raining from heaven. For believers, it's as if the fire that once consumed him now dances in the sky as tribute. Lawrence's life and death still challenge us. In a world obsessed with wealth, comfort, and avoiding pain, his story asks hard questions. What do we value? What would we stand for? What would we sacrifice? For Lawrence, the answer was clear. His faith wasn't just an idea. It was something worth dying for. And in dying, he gave the world an unforgettable image, not of suffering, but of strength, humor, and unwavering love. A man who faced the worst of human cruelty and smiled. A man who burned, but did not break. A man who turned even his own death into a sermon that still speaks across the century.